This will be another brief tour through another several hundred, if not thousands, of years of history in this review of Phyllis Day's and Jerome Schill's Chapter 4 from A New History of Social Welfare. And in this particular chapter, we're looking at our history from the time of the feudal estates up into what we now know as the welfare state. So really, we're really kind of talking about medieval times, let's say up into the 16 or 1700s. Up until the time of colonization of America, which was 16 or 1700s. This is what we're studying here. So, in the Middle Ages, as you know from your history studies over the years in high school, feudalism was the primary economic system in Europe, and a feudal estate was essentially a castle with lords who generally had knights who were his army and his protectors or whatever. And they were generally fairly wealthy and well-to-do in those times. Wealthy being a relative term, but well off, I guess, is what I want to say. Around those castles, peasants or serfs, as they were known at the time, would place their homes close to the castle, hoping to get protection from the lords, knights, and armies and things like this from marauders that would go around from community to community, I guess, and pillage and plunder, those kinds of things. And so, in the course of doing so, the serfs would get protection from the castle. In exchange for that, they would grow food and things, and they would supply the lords with food. And other goods that they needed within the castle. So it was sort of this mutually beneficial exchange for protection for goods and services and things like this that developed. And if anytime you ever see movies about men in castles in medieval times, and then when they venture out of the castles, they've got this village of people that are really kind of lower class and artisans and farmers and things, and that those would be their serfs essentially. And so the peasants were dependent upon the strong man and bonded themselves to the lord, the strong man, in exchange for protection from marauders. And you were really born into your socioeconomic status. The only way you could move up, you couldn't become a lord, you couldn't become a knight, really. I think the only way you could move up in status was to become a cleric, in a religious area, and then you could get to a higher socioeconomic status. But otherwise, you were stuck in your position and you couldn't do anything about it. If you were born a peasant, you would stay a peasant all your life. Technology began to change, and for a number of different reasons, serfdom became economically unfeasible. And so, instead of going about getting goods and services and things in exchange for their protection, the lords began to charge rents and fees, and as a part of that, then a cash economy began to emerge, and ultimately the peasants were forced from their farms because mechanization was one of those things. And with technology, they began to the small farm, let's say, the small peasant production couldn't keep up with the kinds of things that could be done now with mechanization, and so this cash economy emerged, and the peasants were forced from their farms, and no longer getting protection from the lords, they would begin to move about and beg, so this begging became a problem. They were, in those days, they were known as vagabonds. And really, it became necessary for the communities to regulate the poor because of the problem that begging was pretty dominant in those areas in that era. That was really quite a big problem. So, this conversion to the cash-based economy led to the rise of capitalism and ultimately to the Protestant Reformation. And social welfare, having an impact on community economics, became focused on the control of the poor. What do we do with the problem of these beggars? How do we deal with them? How do we keep them off our doorstep more than anything? And understand, as you look at this process here, one of the things that we're looking at is the fact that this isn't these beggars aren't beggars by choice. They're kind of pushed into this lifestyle because of the changes in the economy and the lack of opportunity to move up and to improve themselves at all through education. Well, education as we know it wasn't available in those days, but they really were kind of pushed into this lifestyle because of the changes in the economic systems that were going on around them, and wasn't really something that was their doing at all. And yet, controlling these poor people, what became sort of the focus of things when we began to address this issue of what to do about the beggars. Wealthy people could participate in charitable efforts and give to the poor and do things for the poor, and in the minds of the church, this just demonstrated that God liked it that people would become wealthy because they can help the poor and the needy. Really, as Dave points out in her text, I think the wealthy kind of had literally the best of both worlds. They could be wealthy here, and because they were helping the needy, they could also go to heaven and find salvation in the next life as well. So they're really, really blessed, wealthy people, and so the wealthy began to be seen as sort of God's favored few. The poor, meanwhile, we begin to see them in a couple of different categories: the worthy versus the unworthy poor. And the unworthy poor very quickly became those who were able-bodied. There was a recognition that people with disabilities and deformities couldn't help themselves, and so efforts were made to provide more assistance to them. But those who just seemed not to be working or whatever and seemed able to do that began to become separated out as unworthy of help, and their poverty was seen as the result of their own failures. The policies and beliefs about social welfare began to be tied to one person's potential to contribute to the labor market. You were either a past, present, or future contributor to the labor force. And so because of that, children who were living with poor people were also seen as being under the influence of individuals who would hurt them more than help them, and so there were efforts were made to get them away from their indigent parents whenever possible. By the 1700s, capitalism was dominant and maximizing profit, which is really the goal of capitalism, right? I mean, if in a capitalist economy, the successful person has the most profit. And anything he does to reduce that profit, for instance, offering higher wages, makes that person less successful. So maximizing profits was indeed the primary focus of business in this era. And by providing lower wages, which comes with higher profits, lower wages for those who are working for you, the poor wound up working longer to make a living. So and this little flow chart kind of tells you a little bit about this, that low wages, one of the things that low wages do is provide for a ready workforce. Aside from providing higher profits to the owners or the businessman, it also provides for a ready workforce. When there are people who are out of work, or if you make low wages, you always want to work longer so you can make more money, maybe take another job so that you can get, have more money or whatever. So there's a ready workforce available at all times, higher profits for the producer. The low wages then, this results in increased poverty, and more starvation, criminal activity, begging, unrest, social unrest, which then gives the government a need to control the poor and the needy. The poor and the needy become uncomfortable with that, unhappy with that, and rebel or revolt against that, which demands even harsher laws and control of the needy. And so on and on. You can kind of see a little bit about how in the economic system, in the capitalist economic system, while low wages is something that is a goal more or less of the owners who are trying to maximize profits, it sets up a lot of problems, and also kind of implements that social control part of the social welfare that we had spoken about in our first lectures. Sets that all up in motion as well. There were some political economic theories that were being bantied about in the Middle Ages in the 1700s that also had something to do with how the welfare system developed. Malthus, the Malthusian beliefs was that essentially that as our population increased, it would increase in much more rapid pace than our ability to provide resources, and that ultimately the world would become overpopulated. Now there were things about Malthus that the Malthusian theory that of course, have not proven to be true. And one of the things is, Malthus didn't anticipate that we would develop more effective and efficient means of growing food, and we certainly have done that. And also, the birth control and population control efforts were also something that Malthus didn't perceive. So this never came to be. But in that era, there was a lot of people who subscribed to that theory, and so there was a concern about too many people, and on the one hand, in the long-term future. There was a belief in the Darwinian theory also during this period of time about his theories developed about evolution, and that evolution should be, evolves naturally by natural selection, that is, survival of the fittest, that nature chooses who lives and who dies, and so the strong in the species are the ones that do survive because of that. The weak are culled from the herd, so to speak, and so I think combining some Malthusian theory and concerns about overpopulation, Darwinian theory about how evolution evolves so naturally so that the strongest in a species survive. A belief developed out of this that helping the poor would result in a population of dependent and moronic and immoral persons. This is really the foundation for that American value that Day wrote about it in the first chapter, social Darwinism, right? So that's what we're talking about here. So this belief begins to develop during this period of time. At this, around the same time or later in this period, I should say, Karl Marx is developing his theories of socialism, advancing the notion that resources should be shared by all members of society. Now, European countries were closer to the development of this thought, and were much their programs and their systems were developed more progressively because of the fact that they were more exposed to these socialist kinds of thinking. This is where, back in these days, the separation of the ocean really made a big difference for us. Our attitudes arising mostly from capitalism and Protestantism, based more on the ideologies of individual responsibility and taking care of yourself. And so this is one of the reasons why, for instance, as we work through this material this semester, we're going to find that particularly European nations, other advanced industrialized nations, are really quite okay with providing social benefits to its citizens, very different from our own, where individuals have to prove a need before the taxpayer will provide any support to them. And we talked about the Elizabethan Poor Laws in 1601, I believe, that because of the fact that the English communities couldn't provide for the poor, the beggars, and the wanderers going from community to community looking for work, it became necessary to establish laws about who was responsible for the poor. And actually, another thing it did was it helped to define that social welfare policy should be a part of labor policy, that it really isn't so much, it isn't just about helping people, but it's really about getting them to work or finding them a job or something like this. And those who were receiving benefits weren't seen so much as being needy as it was being seen as somebody who wasn't working and wasn't contributing. And so the responsibility of families became a part of law in this, and for those individuals who didn't have any family around, or who were not able to care for themselves at all, the impotent poor, that is the worthy poor, the ones who couldn't take care of themselves, almshouses would be created. These were places where they could go and stay and be cared for by the government or by the community. But if you were an able-bodied poor, you were put into a workhouse, and you were forced to work in order to live. Now, that doesn't seem so bad, I think, when you think about, I have to work in order to live, because we all have to do that. But again, you can see the dichotomy there in how we're dealing with the poor already way back in the 1600s. So again, responsibility for the poor rested first with the self, then with the family, and then the local community. And you do see that the national government isn't at all in that chain of reasoning there, and more on that in the next couple of chapters. So that's it for chapter 4 in the Day text, and take a break and come back, and we'll continue on our quick walk through history and social welfare.